what I think you need in any company to get from, let's say, maybe not 0 to 1, but 1 to 10, is that infrastructure layer below it. And so, does all the data exist in a singular data lake such that everyone
Mm.
can have access to the data across the organization in maybe not from real time and as close to real time as you can possibly get? Do you have real time financial information, occupancy, ADRs, right? Being able to sort of see what's on the books day by day, property by property, room type by room type. And so there was a lot of that work that we put in place. And I think it's not sexy and it's not necessarily the glamorous stuff that people get super excited about. But when you put that in place, it gives you a real ability to understand where you are and where you need to get to. And you can start to make just increasingly data driven decisions, which is great.
You're listening to Slick Talk, the hospitality podcast, a podcast for those who are in and around the hospitality industry who love, live, and breathe what they do. You can join us for candid and unscripted conversations with hospitality experts and founders as we go deeper into their personal stories while they're sharing their triumphs and trials that got them to where they are today. I'm your host, Will Slickers, and you're listening to an episode of Slick Talk, the hospitality podcast. Now, let's begin. I'm super excited to have the CEO of Mint House, Christian Lee, on the show. I actually got to meet Christian in New York at the Skift STR Summit, which was an exciting event. Very well done. So shout out to Skift for putting on a good summit. Really love the quality of the content. Christian, you were on stage and I got to fanboy a little bit personally. And so I just want to say thank you for taking the opportunity to join me on the show and geek out a little bit more. I would love if you could start us off. Where does your journey in not just hospitality, but in overall business begin? Because I always find the interesting threads that people somehow find their way into our lovely industry.
So I actually grew up not so far from where I am right now in Fargo, North Dakota, out in Minnesota at our lake place here. But I lived overseas when I was very young in Pakistan, actually. And so we traveled around a lot, was fascinated by the whole world of travel and hospitality and the way things, were sort of done in Asia versus the US versus other places. And I went to New York after college. First 15, 18 years of my career were all large companies, Citigroup, Time Warner Cable. And once we had sold Time Warner Cable to Charter in 2015, I loved working at big companies. There's huge advantages to it, a brand and resources and all these wonderful things that you get access to. But I wanted to try a startup. I wanted to kind of get that entrepreneurial, bug itch a little bit, something where you're able to, have a bit more impact. Talk to a few companies. I actually, with a colleague, guy named Artie Minson, joined a company called WeWork in 2015 when it was still very small. It was, maybe, a dozen or, 15, 20 buildings or so, a couple hundred employees. And it was clear that there was a lot of potential in this space. Wasn't clear exactly what was going to happen, but it was a super interesting experience. My real first foray into real estate in that sense. I was CFO there for a little under 2 years. And then with some of the experiences I'd had over in Asia, as we started to expand into Asia, there was an opportunity to go and help, find some local teams and local partners and try to build and expand the businesses, China, Japan, India, all across Asia, which was amazing. Got to do that with my wife and my two boys. We moved back during the middle of COVID, which was a whole situation coming from China to the US during, peak of COVID. But it was actually then that I first got introduced to Mintos. A friend of mine who was an investor and on the board, and I connected and he introduced me to Will. I actually ended up putting a little bit of money into the company at the time and kind of spent some time just talking with Will about what experiences I had seen for better, for worse at WeWork. I was at a supply chain company at the time. And then about, I guess, 2 years ago, Will called and said, "Hey, listen, the board's interested in potentially talking to you about a CEO position." Will is the founder of Mintos. And I said, yeah, it's an interesting company. It's a really interesting space, ties into, a bunch of stuff I've done before. So let's have a conversation. And about a year and a half ago, I joined as CEO. And so it's been a exciting and interesting year and a half so far.
All right, Slick Talkers, sorry to interrupt. As you know, Great partners at Minute have sponsored this episode. They sponsor the show. So every episode is filled with amazing minutes. No pun intended. So if you don't know who Minute is or what they do, we see that we have a lot of new slick talkers out there in the world. So one, thank you for tuning into the show. Every listen, every time you hit play means so much to me and to my team. So thank you. But if you are new, Minute is an amazing noise detection device. Not only do they measure noise decibel levels inside of your vacation homes or your hotels, they actually can detect smoke. Not only that, if you're an outdoor kind of a unique stay person or just have an amazing outdoor amenities for your guests, from pools to hot tubs to cookout pads, all the stuff, they have an outdoor sensor that is specifically made for outdoor noise. Because I didn't know this, but noise outside and noise inside actually makes a difference. So you don't have to worry about constantly making sure, are people partying at your place, are the cleaners there, or like whatever kind of issue might happen. You can get that peace of mind with Minute at your side. So as you grow, Minute will grow with you. They have an amazing team of support, and they have an amazing technology from hardware and the software. When the two marry, it's just a beautiful combination. We use Minute in all of our vacation homes and hotels with our management company, and it's the best decision we've made because we are so dispersed and we are so spread out that having Minute just is a necessity for our operations. So get with Minute, go to the link in the show notes, let them know that Will from Slick Talk sent you. They'll give you a sweet deal. And of course, you know the drill. We're back to the episode, and I hope you enjoy. They threw you to the wolves really quickly from WeWork to Mint House and STRs. It's quite the fascinating jump, but I think it's super exciting because obviously, right, like there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences at the same time. I'm curious though, before getting into the short-term rental kind of sector part of your story, is how are you feeling from big company to startup now? How has that transition been for you? As you said, obviously big companies comes with a lot of perks, resources, etc. But startups, they're fun, they're scrappy, they're a little fast paced. So I'm curious to see how you feel.
Yeah, I mean, this is now the third one I've done. I mean, WeWork started very small and then got big. Transfix, where I was before this, was definitely more of a startup.
Mm,
This is certainly a startup. I love it. Look, there's pros and cons to each, right? You can't sort of sit there and say, oh, well, I think the days of, the glamour of startups and everything is just easy and money flows in. That was maybe, 4 or 5 years ago. I think at this point, if you're in it because you really have a passion to try and build something. When I was at Time Warner Cable, you picked up the phone. Well, first of all, I didn't have to pick up the phone, right? People will just call you, say,
mhm.
here's this idea, here's this thing. We want to pitch you on this. We want to talk to you about this. Like, now you pick up the phone and they're like, unless they're really deep in the hospitality industry, it's like, what's Mintos? And so you have to explain it.
Yeah.
And so there's just, it's very different. But if you're passionate about it, if you're willing to kind of put that work in, the impact you can have at a small company, a startup, is just, sort of orders of magnitude different than you can at a big company. As I said, big companies have their huge advantages as well. And so it can be fun to do things with a big full pocket of resources and to be able to put the whole scale of an organization behind something once you make that decision to go do it. So I wouldn't say there's one path that's better than others. I'm very lucky to have been able to do both. I've loved that part of my journey of kind of being able to be in both of those worlds. And I think it's somewhat situational dependent. If you find something you're really passionate about, you really like, it can be a great opportunity to kind of go in and try it.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And think you hit the nail on the head there. The other question I wanted to ask you about before getting into Mint House and short term rental stuff is the move from, Asia to America during COVID. Let's Can you just share some of the crazy stories? Because I'm sure it must have been very intense, especially with the family. You got two boys and your wife, and I can imagine that the move was not as fun as you probably were hoping.
So, yeah, to go back, we were in Shanghai, kind of up until the end of 2019. And we had actually been overseas. We had been on a Christmas holiday in Sri Lanka. And we came back for a couple of weeks and we had started to hear in Shanghai, there was rumors going around of, this pneumonia like illness, and they had kind of shut Wuhan down. And then it was Chinese New Year. And so we left actually to go to Japan.
Mm,
We had gone skiing there every year, which separate story, is an amazing hospitality experience and really an unbelievable place to be. And when we were there, they started shut down schools across the country.
Mm.
So we stayed in Japan for a few weeks. And then, I quickly realized that like if I was just going to live at a ski resort in Japan, I was going to go bankrupt very, very soon. And so we had to make some alternative plans. For the kids, that was February of 20. And so I had some work I had to do back in the US. So we all went together as a family back to the US because we didn't want to risk getting separated, which is ironic given what ends up happening later in the story. But we were actually renovating our apartment at the time. So we stayed in a friend's
Mm.
basement. And at the time, there was a few cases of COVID in the US, but it wasn't really bad. And China had got it under control at that point. But we didn't know what was going to happen if we went back to China. So I actually ended up going back first.
Mm.
I ended up having to go to quarantine for 2 weeks, stuck in a hotel room, which, wasn't great. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was certainly something I didn't want my boys to have to go through. They were quite young at that time.
Mhm.
And so we said, well, just wait a little bit. Maybe, China will open up, the US will get better, it'll all be fine. Not to ruin the ending, it does not get better. And so my wife and the boys ended up actually moving to Minnesota to the lake place for a while. And then I was in China, and all of a sudden can I get out? Because there was no flights. There was one flight a week that was going back and forth. You couldn't get a seat on it. And eventually I was able to get a seat on a flight for, I think it was June 16th or something. And the day after that, Trump tweeted out that because China wasn't letting US airlines come into China, that he was going to cancel all Chinese flights coming into the US starting on June 16th. Like, you gotta be kidding me.
Dang.
But, and no one knew anything because no one really knew what
Yeah.
was going to happen at that point. Were the flights going to happen? Were they not? Was he actually going to follow through with it? There was a whole situation. Long story short, I ended up sort of winding down all of the work I had done in Asia. I mean, the goal there had been to basically build up local teams and local partners and then
Mm.
ultimately have them run that. We were well on our way to doing that. We had a local partner in China. We had a local partner in India. We had SoftBank in Japan. So there was we had put in place a lot of the structures that we wanted to put in place in Asia. So it made sense for me to come back. Also, my family was there. So I wanted to get out.
Mhm.
And it ended up being, sort of for all of the hand wringing and what was going to happen, I ended up getting on the flight. It was totally fine. There was no flights in the air. I got to JFK. There was no one there. Yeah, I will say it was a fascinating experience of, having gone through getting into China and the hazmat suits and the testing and all of that. Then you show up back in the US. Now this is June of 2020. And, it's like some person at the airport handing you a postcard saying, if you feel sick, please call this number. I mean, there was
Mhm.
no testing, there was no nothing. So, but I made it back to the lake cabin and then we stayed here for 6 months during COVID. So it was a pretty crazy experience.
Yeah, I don't miss the early days of like, "Oh, shit, the world's kinda going, a lot different than we expected." This is, very obviously no one planned for, but then also that period of being like, "You know what? I get some time off. I'm actually gonna enjoy some, like, quality time at home, working out, doing this, doing the things I didn't get to do," or putting your face down and just grinding and trying to survive and kind of a balance of both, I feel like, but yeah, those were the good old days.
Yeah, no, I mean, this has been much written about and talked about, but I think if
Yeah,
you had some stability at home, some, stability in your career, otherwise, like it really was a unique time of spending time with family and just sort of, not being in the hustle. Obviously,
yeah,
anyone with health challenges, et cetera,
for
was,
sure.
was a terrible, but yeah, it was an interesting time.
Yeah, I, just quit my hotel management job December
Oh,
27th
wow.
of 28 or 2019. I went full time with the podcast and was like calling my mom's like, "Yeah, I'm going to London. I'm doing all these things." And I remember being in London when President Trump, closed down the borders and basically or announced a national
Mm,
emergency and all
jeez.
this stuff and just being like in London, being like, "How am I gonna get home?" And my flight back, I'd like stop in Iceland and there was a flight next to my gate going to Beijing. And every person on that flight was getting dressed in hazmat suits. And I just remember looking at this little girl who was kind of standing next to me while her mom's putting on the hazmat suit for her. And she like looks at me straight in the face and just goes, "Huh, huh," and just like coughs at me. I was like,
Oh
Oh,
my
I was like,
god.
"Oh gosh, like, we're screwed."
Uh,
But yeah, it was fun, crazy, scary times. It was very weird period of life. But yeah, anyways, without going
yeah,
down the COVID rabbit hole,
exactly.
let's talk about Mint House. So for the listeners that don't know, we have a mixed audience of traditional VRMs, some new Airbnb hosts getting started in the industry, and then a lot of tech experts and industry providers from consulting, platform, software, etc. But a lot of operators that kind of come from both hotels and short-term rentals. And I'd love to know kind of a little bit more about the brand of Mint House and the certain sector of the short-term rental industry that you guys service and have built your business around.
Yeah. So I think to do that, it's helpful to go back to, the founding vision that Will had when he first started the company. And, the notion and different people and different companies have taken different approaches into this industry, as you noted.
Mhm,
So the original vision was you had a number of corporate employees. And this was back in, 2016, 2017, 2018. And it was clear that Airbnb was really growing very quickly at the time. There was this huge demand to stay in places that weren't hotels. At the
mhm.
time, Airbnb was a much cheaper alternative, but also it gave you the ability to do all the things that you can do in a home, right? Wash your clothes, cook a meal, not have to eat everywhere out, make what you want for breakfast, do all the things that come with being at a short term rental. But there's really no way for corporate employees to do. I'm sure, as most of your listeners know, big corporations have what's known as duty of care. And so when their employees go somewhere on business, they have to ensure that it's a safe place to be, that it meets certain standards. I joke that the cameras are, outside the home looking at the door, not inside the home, and sometimes in Airbnbs that's, turned the other way around. And so it really wasn't easy, certainly to be compliant in policy and kind of as a younger employee, kind of show up and stay at an Airbnb when you were traveling for work, which is probably what you wanted to do. Um, and so the DNA of the company was, well, how could we service these corporate employees, right?
Mhm.
Who are going to major urban or core suburban areas, who want all of the flexibilities, the amenity of home, those things, but want the consistency of a hotel, both because they don't want to do chores on the way out
Yeah.
and because their companies want to make sure that there's the right type of safety and security, that there's, 24/7 customer care if needed, that if there's a problem, there's someone there to help them solve it, that it's not going to get canceled at the last minute because, someone got COVID or sick or something else. All the sort of, things that can happen in, a pure marketplace model. So that was sort of the original vision. And that was going very well. There was a lot of demand. It was growing. And of course, then COVID hit,
Mhm.
not to go back to the COVID
Yeah.
stories, but that all got decimated, right? There was no corporate travel. But then what you saw was, at least the temporary rise of the digital nomads
Mhm.
and people saying, well, I need a place to go live for a period of time. That's not in my city, that's somewhere else. Maybe it's closer to my family. Maybe it's just a temporary change of pace because I can. And so you saw this real increase in different types of people coming both to Mint House, but to short term rental in general. So then coming out of COVID, I think there was a fundamental change in the industry, but for Mint House in particular, saying, well, listen, corporate is still this very big core of what we wanted to do. And we saw business travel really come back. We're continuing to see that trend, especially because so many workplaces are hybrid that, people still need to come in and, be at HQ, whether that's in Denver or New York or Nashville or wherever it happens to be, but they don't necessarily live there. And so they come in, they stay for a little bit longer, and that's where short-term rental is great. On top of that, though, we also recognize that there's a huge demand for families who are traveling, for even leisure guests who just want a different type of experience. They want those amenities, that can come from a homestay, but to have the consistency, reliability, and the services that a hotel provides. So that's kind of what we bring together is that professional managed short term.
I love that. And yeah, like you said, not to go back to the COVID days, but I do want to bring up those times in this industry specifically because I think it was so important and crucial for the specifically in your guys' sector, like the multifamily corporate. You're in these urban areas, you're not in single family homes. There's a lot of carnage that happened in this sector, say Alfred's, Domios, Lyrics. hundreds of millions of dollars in funding coming into these, these brands, and they're no longer here. We have you guys, we have Romy, we have very few urban operators left. So what do you think specifically was the cornerstone or the kind of shining light at the end of the tunnel for Mint House during that time of your guys' competitors just going under versus you guys making out on the other side to 2024 where we are today, where hopefully is still a growing business. And, obviously we've seen that return of travel and a lot of other differences from 2020, but would love to know, like, what was your guys' kind of anchor to get through the other side?
So I'd say a couple things. The first is we had, in part, and some of this predates
Yeah.
me, right? Or much of it predates me. So, but I think, like many companies in the early days, there was the notion of, well, just take units and space wherever you can find
Hmm.
it. A lot of people would go and just lease out however many units were available in apartment buildings scattered. And I think there was a recognition that scale was really important, scale in a building, scale in a city. And if you can, if you have the scale, without scale, it's difficult to get the operational leverage to do the things that you want to do to be a professionally managed short-term rental operator.
Yeah.
And so that was helpful. We had made that transition pretty early on to trying to have at least, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 plus units in the building. Discipline around, what it takes to furnish a unit. That's a big deal. Like those upfront costs are just a huge part of the value equation of this. And it has to be both, furnishings that make sense that people want to stay there, but they also need to be, maybe not fully hospitality grade, but pretty close to hospitality grade, but at a reasonable price point. Right. And so you got to spend a lot of time figuring out how to make that equation work. And then I do think that the focus on corporate, even though that went away during COVID, being built toward that type of service model was helpful. And as you got scale, it obviously sort of, the efficiency scales with it, but that type of thing that guests were looking for was really important. That it's not just you go and buyer beware and you have to figure
Mm.
it out on your own. There's 24/7 guest care available, whether that's in person or just virtually via, the phone or text or wherever, however you get it. There's services that are available. There's cleaning. There's a lot of things that people wanted in addition to just the pure home style stay. And I think that combination helped us get to where we are today.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's you bring up really good points, and I do want to cover some of this, a little bit later on in the episode around scale, right? Like scale is such a buzzword in our industry, especially, the kind of come out of COVID days like 2021, 2022, saw a lot of capital come into the industry, mostly on the vendor side, but even operators, got a piece of the pie. But before we get into that, I'm very curious. I want to ask you this question and I'm kind of throwing you for a curveball. So please, take your time if you need it. But I would love to know, since you said that the COVID days were pre your time, right? They kind of pre historically, before you. Would love to know, after you've come in now as CEO, you've got this experience, you've been a CFO, you've been with WeWork, you've had, this startup entrepreneurial bug scratched a little bit. Coming into Mint House now, what would you say if someone were to been working for the company prior to you and then after you joining as CEO, what do you think they would say was the biggest difference in the change of the company, whether it was operations or culture or just anything? Like, what do you think they would say was the biggest change?
Good question. I'd say the one thing we've really tried to put in place is, well, probably two things. Number one, a lot of infrastructure layer to allow us to
Mm.
scale. And the second I'd say is focus. And so it is very easy when you're at a startup to, inappropriate, I think a lot of times to just really focus on the product, right? And make sure the product is great. And I think Mintos did a really good job of that. There was an amazing product. There was an amazing operational team. I mean, there's all of the things were so great. What I think you need in any company to get from, let's say, maybe not 0 to 1, but 1 to 10 is that infrastructure layer below it. And so, does all the data exist in a singular data lake such that everyone
Mm.
can have access to the data across the organization in, maybe not from real time and as close to real time as you can possibly get? Do you have real-time financial information, occupancy, ADRs, right? Being able to sort of see what's, on the books day by day, property by property, room type by room type. And so there was a lot of that work that we put in place. And I think it's not sexy and it's not necessarily the glamorous stuff that people get super excited about. But when you put that in place, it gives you a real ability to understand where you are and where you need to get to. And you can start to make just increasingly data driven decisions, which is great. That's been one huge focus or one key area of investment and, things that we put into the company. And the other is focus, right? Just continuing to say there's a 50 different things we could be doing.
Yeah.
What are the things that are going to have the biggest impact right now? And and I wouldn't even say that was sort of Minto specific as much as it was all startups pre, you know, 2022, when there was
Mhm.
huge amounts of capital available, when there was, interest rates were zero, money was free, multi-$100 billion funds sloshing money everywhere. It was easy to say, well, let's just do everything all at once. And the solution is just more people and, put more resources in. Every startup has had to adjust to the new reality that you've got a hyper focus. And again, that's partly me and it's partly just the reality of the world post, the sort of valuation resets and capital resets
Yeah.
and all of that in the early 2020s of now we've got to figure out what is the thing that's going to drive the most value for the least amount of resources.
100%. Very well said. I love that. And we've had other CEOs on the podcast that weren't the founders or came in, either right before COVID or during COVID or that kind of post era. And, the question I always have to myself without saying it out loud is how are you not terrified of jumping into an industry that you don't know? It's a brand new business. Like you said, without having like that data lake for everyone to have access to the data and all this stuff, right? Like that infrastructure, you don't have that. So how do you truly know the business and how it's gonna go. Like, I don't know, like there's so much risk, right, on your part. I talked to Steve Davis from Operto. I was like, "You're not the founder. How did you feel coming into this industry, like, just straight off the plane from Canada?" And went through the whole interview with Darren and all this other stuff, right? Like, how did you get comfortable? And then he's been there close to 4 years. So it's like, okay, I see now. It's like, can't imagine the company without you being the CEO. But that first initial step, right? Jumping into something so brand new to you. What was your kind of thought process and what made that decision kind of a little bit easier and more or less like less nerve wracking, I would say, because I would be pretty nervous taking that role.
Well, I mean, you left your hospitality to go start a podcast. So, I mean,
Yeah.
everyone, listen, there's things in life you obviously can't ever know the full risks. But, for me, it was I had gotten to know Will and some of the team because I got introduced earlier. So I had invested a little bit. I got to know the board. I had talked to quite a few people there just on an ongoing basis. And so that was helpful, right? I at least knew some of the players and what was going on, some of the dynamics that were existed in the company at the board level, et cetera. I got to spend some time with the board. And so that was super helpful. And, I really felt comfortable with the people who were sitting around the table, that they were smart, but also pragmatic. They understood that there were real opportunities and real challenges, that this, like anything that, is worth doing, there's obviously, a massive market opportunity, but there's a million things that can go wrong. And so I think they understood both of that. It was also a board that I really, you had a combination of investors, but you also had, Alan Smith, who was the former CEO of the Four Seasons, so understood
Mm.
hospitality very deeply. There was a number of people, as advisors and others involved, who really understood real estate, hospitality, and the startup world. And so I think that was really interesting and compelling to me. And, the model just made sense. I mean, I understood and still understand that there are real challenges to scaling this model,
Yeah.
but there's a real shift. I mean, there's, as I've sort of said in some other, forums, if you know that there's a demand from the guest side, and we know that's the case. If you look at, depending on the data source you look at, but the intention of where people want to stay for travel coming up is, at least 15 to maybe 20, 25%. And, staying at alternative accommodations. And if you look at the younger, right, Gen Z millennials, that's much higher than that of people who have stayed there, who have intention to stay. At the same time, you have, a big gap in, services that are offered. There's a number of marketplaces, but people do want that professional cleaning. They do want to know that it's safe and secure. They do want to know that things are going to work when they get there. If something doesn't work, there's
Yeah.
someone they can reach out to, that there's someone there taking care of them. And so you have this sort of huge guest demand and this sort of missing piece in the middle there. And then on the real estate side, there is a real, I think, growing acceptance within the institutional, multifamily world, that STR is going to be a part of what they do going forward.
Mhm.
You're seeing more and more buildings get financed as purely STR, or at least with a significant portion of STR in their building. You're seeing people writing equity and debt checks into these types of projects. You're seeing, we're seeing and hearing more and more large institutional owners saying, how do we fit this into our portfolio? Because they're seeing the demand side, from the guest, and saying, well, listen, if I can get, 2.5, 3x monthly rental from this, and then I can kind of keep the costs at a reasonable level, I have NOI upside. So there's sort of demand on both sides. And so as long as you see that, there should be a way to, to make that work. Doesn't always mean it's going to happen, but at least you can kind of know enough to say, well, I really like the people that are there. I like the product's been built. I think there's a long-term demand on both the supply side as well as the demand side. And so there's enough there to at least start from, to say, yep, I can see where this could go.
All right, I'm back. Sorry to interrupt, but you have to hear about our partners and friends at Hostfully. Not only are they an amazing property management software, they're an amazing team. I've been friends and partners with Hostfully for over 4 years now, and it's been an amazing 4 years. I can't complain because as I continue to grow my business with our property management company, they continue to update and grow their products and features within the Hostfully platform, and it just gets better over time. So, with us, we have a unified inbox, we have amazing marketplace, not only for the rest of our tech stack to integrate, which is awesome because they work with so many people, but then the third piece is the distribution is built in. So you don't have to fully rely on a channel manager. You can actually rely on the amazing integrations that Hostly has with Airbnb, Verbo, Booking.com, Marriott, Homes and Villas, you name it. They have what you need in order to get your inventory, your properties to the right people. It's kind of a no-brainer, but I'm going to tell you this anyways. You're going to get a special deal with Hostfully with the link in the show notes. You'll just have to let them know if you love the product and then just tell them that we'll send you. So that way you can get that amazing Slick Talk deal. And of course, we're back to the episode. Thanks for tuning in. And I hope you enjoy. That makes sense. And the board piece is always kind of, I'm solo founder over here. I don't have a board. I don't have investors. We have a small team of 4 or 5 employees. So nothing crazy to that level. So I think having a board like that, some advisors could make a transition, moving into a company like Mint House a lot easier. So that makes a lot more sense to me. I'm just, so not used to that. So that's a great way to put it. And I'm curious, coming back to this scale question, and I know the answer to this, at least I think I know the answer to this, but you talked about scale in a building versus scale in a city. Do you think you could have one without the other?
Yes, in the sense that, so I'll use Nashville as an example for us. So we now have 3 properties in Nashville. We have several more in the works. And one of our more recent deals was a small 5-unit, really boutique building. And it's 100% of the building. It's only 5 units in the building.
Mm,
But that building would not have made sense for us, from scale in the building perspective, because you can't really support any of the things that you need to do in just that building.
mhm,
But that building, a 5-minute walk away from there is one of our sort of earlier buildings, flagship Nashville Reserve. It's in the old Federal Reserve building. It's beautiful. You can host a wedding there. We have corporate events. It's a full service property. And
mm,
so we are able to basically service some of that demand from the boutique property via the building that we have there. And so we have scale in the city, which allows us to maybe take some buildings that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to take
mm,
if we were looking at that building on a standalone basis.
yeah.
So I think it's important that you have scale in a city, and that you have, kind of a couple big flagship buildings in that city. But from there, then that gives you a little bit of operational flexibility to take on some other properties that are maybe, sort of niche, or only work if they can be supported by some of the infrastructure you have in the city.
Yeah, no, totally Makes sense and great answer. Great response. You're just killing it today, Christian. You're really crushing it. I would love to know in the sense of kind of coming back to Skift, right? You're on stage at Skift and remember you talking specifically about hotel licenses. And I think even just before this call, you even said, like no longer are the days where the guests don't want this type of inventory. It just makes sense, right? Like they want the amenities, yet they want the consistency. That's what hotels do really well. That's why I think Marriott Homes and Villas is doing really well as a platform in itself because they have that just drive for trust and consistency, and they've shoved that down their partners' throats. That in the best way possible for anyone at Marriott listening to this. I promise I don't mean that the bad way,
Right.
but like just being so standard, driven. I think it's so notable to realize that's kind of what their success is. And so for you guys, having hotel licenses, focusing on consistency, but having that also unique vacation rental type of amenities with kitchen, washer dryer plus security. It's a unique approach. And I think again, kind of looking at the market of other operators, it's not many. It's not a lot of big names like there was in 2020. So can you maybe share a little bit more on the model of kind of like why that approach happened? Does that model can really work for you? Should others look at hotel licenses? What are your overall thoughts on that, like hotel short-term rental hybrid?
Yeah. So that very much depends on, who it is. So what we're seeing, and I think will probably continue to be the trend, although I obviously don't have a crystal ball, so who knows? Especially when you're talking about government regulation, that's probably the hardest thing to actually figure out. But you are seeing more and more cities. Obviously, New York was the first. You can obviously come down on any side of that and debate. It was a great idea. It was the worst idea ever to basically ban short-term rental in the city. There are real concerns that cities and citizens appropriately have about it. Well, does it cause housing shortages? I think the data is obviously pretty subjective on that and doesn't really support that, but that's an argument people have. But I think the more, credible issues are, well, people are coming into my apartment building, they're coming into our city, they're partying, it's a two-person apartment that has 15 people in it and it's getting trashed and that's impacting the neighbors. Or, something happens and there's no one to call and, or, the sort of cameras, like there's lots of things that go along with this that I think are appropriate concerns that people are trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And so for us, the idea of getting, the appropriate licensing when you go into a new city is we both want to be, a partner to the landlord, to the city, to whatever's going on, and say, well, there are certain standards and things that we're going to follow, right? We're going to have fire and life safety so that, if something does happen, God forbid, we have the same standards in there that a hotel does. There's the lighting, there's
Yeah.
the exit signage, we may or may not have someone in the building 24/7. Oftentimes we don't, but we have someone who's available that if you have an issue, if you have a question, you can call them. We have a whole, sort of staffing model that says, okay, I'm here. This is what's going on. This thing happened. You can get in touch with via text, via phone call,
Mhm.
via email, whatever it is. And so a lot of that has, again, it kind of goes back to the DNA, which was, it was meant for initially corporate employees, right? And they needed that type of service and that type of security, et cetera. That has then morphed into there is a broader, I think, demand for, the alternative accommodation, the home style stay that has those things along with it that also happens to fit into what cities want
Mm.
from short-term rental operators. And so, listen, if you're just operating, your own place or you have a house you bought and I don't think it necessarily makes sense to do that. But when you think about the scale opportunity of this market, I think increasingly it is going to be that. I think that cities that, are increasingly, again, like I said, predicting government
Yeah. Yeah.
regulation, I don't really know, but my guess is that there's going to be more and more. You're seeing what's happening in Barcelona. You're seeing what's happening in other places where they're saying it's too much. It's too unregulated. We need people who are going to come in and provide this type of service, but do so in a way that meets fire and life safety standards, that ensures the safety of the guests that are there, that ensures the, long-term residents who are in the building aren't negatively impacted and potentially are positively impacted by having short-term rental in the building. And so It's come about kind of through a variety of ways, but I do think we see this as a significant trend for the future, both because of what guests want, because of what multifamily owners want, and because of what cities, quite frankly, are going to demand of the people who are operating in the space in, certainly in urban and core suburban areas.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too because you talk about, the partying and, 15 people in a two-bedroom suite and cameras. Well, it's like, guys, there's not any difference from a hotel. And let's be honest, if you go to a hotel,
Right.
there's people
Right.
partying in tiny one-bedroom rooms. Happens all the time. Sorry to break the news to the not my backyard people, but people are partying in hotels. There's cameras in hotels. There's way more because they track you from entrance to your room. They can't obviously get into the room. So the only real difference is cameras inside the actual occupants, place of living or staying. But then also, you have a mix of people living in the building versus just staying for a couple nights. In my head, there's really not that much difference, but the people that live there that, have their kids growing up or have friends and, like just all these things, right? Like we all have our own lives. That I get. That frustration part is hard because again, you could have the ideal, customer in mind as you're building a brand like Mint House, but not everyone's going to have that. So it is always kind of funny when people kind of like try to bring up the cameras and the partying and all this something like that, and like, oh, no one's there on property. Guess what? I've been at many hotels that are big name brands that are so short staffed that they barely have someone on property, and that person is usually running around with their head cut off trying to manage five different departments because it's 9 o'clock at night and their manager went home at 5 p.m. So like, I don't know what to tell you in the sense of outside of having actual people that live there versus people that are just staying is really the only big difference. So I don't know. I think maybe some people try to ride that train a little too hard in the short term rental regulation sector compared to like obviously a single family home versus a multifamily unit. It's very different too. But I don't know. I just find it a hard argument to believe in.
Yeah, so I'd say a couple. I mean, I think that's right. I think that the being in a multifamily building for us, that is a big deal. Or being in a neighborhood. I mean, we're not in single family homes, but being in a neighborhood. I think, a hotel to some extent is more self-contained, right? And I think that's part of the argument. And so, but to your point, that doesn't always mean it's the case. I think what for me, what's important is like if you're going to be for us, what we care, if we're going to be in a multifamily building, at a worst case, we should be neutral to the people who live there.
Yeah.
Right. And so for us, that means, you put noise aware, you put odor monitoring, you have a policy that, if we sort of, if it gets to a certain, point escalation, we're sending a text, we're sending a message, someone can show up, there's security on site so that we have the ability to deal with it if something is happening. And that's, look, it's both for our guests as well as for the long-term residents. We try to be on, separate floors, access control, make sure we're integrated with the landlord so that we, when someone's coming in, we know that they can be in certain places at certain hours and not in other places at other hours, that we can turn on and off the locks, all of those things to ensure that there's safety and compliance that both protects our guests and anyone else who's in the building. Where we're going, where we think there's an even bigger opportunity is,
Mhm.
I'll use my, board member's former company, the Four Seasons, right? Four Seasons
Mhm.
Residence and Four Seasons Hotel, where you're actually a resident in that building because you have this great set of amenities from the hotel. And
Mhm.
so, where we see the future is, you're in a building that has Mint House in it and, your relatives come and stay. Great. No problem. They get a discounted rate to come and have a room at our place. So you can kind of be next to each other without having to be right on top of each other or send them to the hotel, 15 miles down the road. We're now offering our cleaning services to people in the building, right? So we have, cleaning staff, in-source, outsource, whatever it is. But we get, economies of scale that you wouldn't be able to get necessarily on your own. But hey, you got relatives coming over for Thanksgiving, you want a deep clean for spring, you can now, through the app, book your cleaning with us. We're doing more and more local F&B partnerships
Mhm.
where we have a version of room service that is, hey, here's, our preferred vendor. And obviously everyone has Uber
Yeah.
Eats and DoorDash and all those things now. But this is a partnership we have, they have, a free drink or they'll, be able to deliver something to you poolside or whatever it is. And so, oh, by the way, if you're a resident, you can get access to that too.
Awesome.
And so I think it's trying to go from a baseline of no worse than, you're totally neutral that Mintos is in the building to, oh, there's actually a huge benefit of having Mintos there because all the services they're providing, and it's a great, addition to the property that I'm in.
Great way to adapt to the potential, arguments of I live in this building. I don't want travelers and next door. Like that's actually a great problem solved in the sense of like why not just offer these services? It helps your guys' business, I'm sure, especially if there's low peaks, you know, whatever seasonalities there are in
100%.
certain markets. So that's actually really smart. You mentioned a couple things around like access control and the app and all this other stuff. So leading into my next question, which I was kind of saving for the last leg of this episode, is what's your thoughts on the actual tech landscape? I know I got to be on a panel with Kent on your team for Operto's Operates and talking about Operto and access control. So shout out to them. But what's your thought from the first day that you started as CEO, getting to learn about property management softwares and access controls and revenue management and all the fun pieces of tech that we have? What's your current thoughts on the landscape from your experience at Midhouse?
Ah, well, we have another 3 hours
Yeah.
to go through.
Joe
Uh,
Rogan style. We'll just keep going.
just keep going. So we'll pull up some YouTube clips.
Yep.
We'll do
Yep.
demos of all the different software that's out
Yeah.
there.
We'll get Jamie to
Be
pull up
great.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a few overarching thoughts. There's not a great singular solution for hospitality in general, right? So let's just sort of
Mhm.
start with that, right? I mean, a lot of the traditional hotels deal with 15, 20 different pieces of legacy software on a good day because, they were started at a very different time and have sort of had to roll it out. You've got
Yeah.
franchisees and, the adoption levels are different depending on what hardware is in place. So there's no clean area in the hospitality industry in general. From there, then you go into what we're doing, which is flexible rental, professionally managed STR, whatever you want to call it. There are very unique needs and use cases that a company like ours has, right? And it's everything from, well, we have certain properties where we want to put on, 20 rooms at a time because they're all the same and they're all one bedrooms, to our boutique property in Nashville where each room is different and it kind of has to be listed one by one. And there's, different technologies allow you to do that in different ways. So I think there needs to be and there is an increasing push to say, okay, well, listen, how do you bring these different models together? STR, hotel, with a solution that works for a company like ours who's trying to do basically a version of both at the same time. So that's a work in process. There's different companies who have made different strides in different areas, but certainly there's not like one perfect solution right now. I think it's getting better and better. And I think there's been a huge amount of improvement, over the past 5 years. I think people recognize this. There's a lot of money going into that space. And I think there will be some really interesting things that come out of it in terms of how you bring that together and then how you sort of integrate the F&B partnerships, how you integrate upgrades and services. And, a lot of stuff that hotels have done kind of through versions of what they have, but kind of bringing that into this world. So I think that's all exciting. For Mint House, what we have always tried to do, and I think it's one of the reasons that I think, you can scale is not to try to build as little of it as we can on our own.
Mm.
It is very difficult to build software for specific operators in the real estate industry. And, we saw this at WeWork. We spent
Mhm.
however many hundreds of millions of dollars. And at the best case, let's just say we had gotten to 10 million members. So you've got a product that touches 10 million people. That's a lot.
Yeah.
But you compare that to, an Amazon or a Facebook or, we're touching billions of people, right? So it's hard to get to that level of scale, B, hard to attract that level of talent because, those software engineers want to go work on problems that touch billions of people. So I think that, third party real estate solutions are probably the right way to go. And then the task for us is how do we find the best in class solutions that work? How do we bring them together? What do we need to put on top of that to create a layer that allows us to personalize the experience for our guests, to integrate it while not having to build huge engineering and development teams? Because again, that's just huge amounts of
Yeah.
money that is difficult to do.
With every kind of short-term rental, whether it's flex, urban, or single family, like you said, there's a lot of softwares out there that have made great strides or have been around a while or just emerging. With all these different business models and every city being different and every neighborhood and all this other stuff, adding a lot more complexity to the sector, not just travel, but just lodging in general. Do you think there could be an all-in-one solution that can help customize and meet that kind of need of a mint house? Or do you think it might need to get a little bit more narrowed down and specific without building your own team, obviously? Because like you said, that's you're just burning money at that point. So you're not a tech company. So would love to, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I think there will be definitely there's going to be, I wouldn't call them niche solutions because I think they're going to be for large, submarkets, but you're right. Single family home is very different than 100 units in an apartment is different than a traditional hotel. Right. And so I think there are going to be specific use cases. I do think there's software getting built that will it will gravitate towards one use case. The other, you may be able to flex into other things, but really getting that, the one use case of, hey, this is the market we're going after, and this is what they need. This is how we're going to do it is going to be increasingly helpful. And it is, one of the things that is sort of interesting about our space is, and we talk about this a lot, is every building is different, right? We are not doing what a traditional big box hotel is we sort of, a prototype and then we're going to go build, or franchisees, developers will build 100 of them. We are going into existing multifamily. And so it means that each building is going to be unique. Now that's a great thing, I think, from a guest perspective. I mean, increasingly, especially again, go back to the millennial Gen Z, is like, they want something that's unique. They want something that's local. They want to go to a place and feel like, hey, I'm staying in a space that's local. It's connected to local restaurants. It's connected to the local bars. It's in the local scene. And so it's not just this sort of sterile thing that's the same no matter what city I'm in.
Mhm.
It is actually different. We embrace that. We try to have local art. We try to have local partnerships. We want that. But it also means that you have to then be able to adapt to the differences in each building, which is why I think it's so important for us to be able to kind of go back and forth and understand what are the best use cases for in this building. How do we best operationalize that? I think that's one of the things that we've spent a lot of time doing and try to figure out. And so then with that, you need some sort of specific use cases. I do think that there will be more investment into that space that allows that to happen. But it's still a work in process.
For sure. I'm glad you didn't say, yeah, we're building our own PMS. So that was like, oh, please don't say it. But yeah, I'm glad you didn't. Man, Christian, I could talk to you probably for another 2 hours at least and go into all sorts of rabbit holes and conversations. But first off, before we wrap up, I want to say thank you for taking the time to be on the episode. It's been such a great conversation. I've been writing a couple notes down to bring up and deep dive into a couple other topics on my own time. But for the listeners, we always ask the question of, if anyone listening to this episode right now wanted to reach out to you or kind of stay in touch in the sense of like follow you on social or anything like that, where's the place that you would want them to go? We'll link it in the show notes. But yeah, where can people reach out if they're interested in learning more about Mint House or you or anything?
Yeah. I mean, LinkedIn is usually the best for me. That's where I'm sort of, active. I'm not on a huge amount of other social, which is a whole problem. Maybe I'm, too old, but that's, we have whole, not whole, we have, a person that does that, but
Yeah.
LinkedIn's probably the easiest. I'm happy to put the profile there, and then, people can reach out to me and we'll connect that way.
Awesome. So we'll make sure to put the link for your LinkedIn, the link for your website, all that stuff in the show notes. But Christian, thank you again so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you and the time you've given and the story you've got to tell of your journey and what you guys are looking forward to in the future. So thank you so much.
No, like, thanks for having me. Super interesting. I've listened to a bunch of your episodes. They're great. Congratulations on making this switch and doing it through COVID and all of the stuff that you've been doing. And so great to connect in New York, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Yes, hopefully I'll see you again coming up in September, maybe for a quick little
Yeah.
New York trip. But for all the slick talkers out there, you know exactly what to do. Give Christian and the Mint House team a ton of love. So grab the links in the show notes. Make sure you like, subscribe, follow, do whatever you need to do. Let them know that you heard the episode and that you enjoyed it. If you can, and show me a sign that you like this episode, leave a review, all that good stuff. I promise I won't go too long on that, but it truly means the world to me as a podcast host. And yeah, thank you so much, Slick Talkers. You know what to do. We'll see you guys again next week. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our show partners for making Slick Talk, the hospitality podcast, possible. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we would love to connect with you outside of the podcast. So you can follow us on all of our social media channels for daily hospitality content, or find us on slicktalkthepodcast.com. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm your host, Will Slickers, and we will see you guys all again next week.